Hello and welcome to this panel discussion on dark patterns and responsible technology design at CyFy 2021. As digital natives, we encounter dark patterns every day of our lives, whether or not we're aware of it. The internet has always been a breeding ground for manipulative design. In 2010, when the term dark patterns was coined, it wasn't expected to become the growing threat that we see it as today. The digitalization of our lives, especially with the pandemic, has led to more data and with that, more vulnerabilities and more opportunities for online manipulation. And that makes this conversation today even more urgent. Our interface with technologies is not about choice, as we may think. Instead, it follows predetermined pathways embedded in design as part of user interface, from nudges to immediate rewards for certain behaviors. These are dark patterns that exploit human psychology and mislead users into behaving in ways they would not otherwise have done. Can these patterns be shaped towards socially positive outcomes that empower users instead of manipulating them? How can socially conscious design be made a part of every stage of design and development? And can we find ways to not give in to dark patterns? Over the next 45 minutes, we will have a conversation on this with a panel that I'm really excited to introduce. Deepika Raman is project lead at the MeitY project on data and AI International Innovation Core, where she works at digital transformation and good governance. Regina Mihindukulasuriya is a reporter at The Print, where she writes on technology. Madhulika Srikumar is program lead at Partnership on AI, an organization that advances responsible AI practices. And Venkatesh Krishnamoorthy is Country Manager India at the Software Alliance, where he works on policy issues on data protection and privacy. A warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us at CyFy 2021. I'd like to begin with Deepika and find out in the first part of this conversation what are we talking about when we're talking about dark patterns, and what are the risks and the societal consequences of dark patterns that you worry about? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sunaina. Uh, I think I would start off with, first of all, saying that I might be a little removed from the panelists here who work very, closely with industry and startup and real design concerns that happen day in, day out. I, on the other hand, work in more so codifying this into what public policy might look like, right? So, but as a user of the internet, I do see day in day out that it's becoming increasingly difficult to stray clear of the various appendages that come with accessing any service or website. And I think that was even more clear in the blackout that happened yesterday when the Facebook service went down. But given all of this, I think with how dark patterns have been progressing, one of my the concerns for me as someone working in public policy is that as a tech savvy individual, I struggle to navigate the internet day in day out with these patterns. My larger concern is how are we designing for to think about nudges or now becoming sludges. How will they work for the digital have-nots, so to say, or those who are beyond the digital divide? People are just getting into the internet community. What does it mean for them? That is a big concern that I am faced with. So I think for me, awareness and really sensitization is one big level that is of concern.
Thanks so much, Deepika. Actually, that sets us off with just the topics that we want to look at: sensitization, awareness, and also to come back to what you spoke about of digital have-nots. I'd like to turn to Regina now and actually quote Harry Brignall, who is an expert in user interface and who coined the term dark patterns. And he has stated that dark patterns have become worse over time. As a user, as a writer on tech, what is your perception of dark patterns and how have they changed over time?
Thanks so much, Sunera. Nice to be here. So dark patterns, it's not something that I thought about too much before getting on this panel or being invited to speak about it. But once I started reading up about more about what is a dark pattern, I started seeing it more and more, and I realized maybe some of the things that we experience as we use apps, use websites, are dark patterns, because it's a dark pattern is supposed to be something that tricks us into doing something that we wouldn't voluntarily do and would not necessarily be beneficial to us, but would most likely be beneficial to whatever website, whatever that internet service is. And like, so once we got to know about this panel, and I was like reading up and really trying to get myself acquainted with what is a dark pattern. Then you start looking out for it, and then you realize these things are actually out there. Like recently, I realized there was a banking app on my phone, and I know I didn't download it. Like, I know I didn't go to the Play Store and download it. I know I didn't go to the banking site and download it. So I don't know how it got there. I uninstalled it, but I'm still not sure how it got there. And I'll probably have to go to the bank to figure out where it came from. What did I click, or did they just upload it or install it on my phone when I signed up for something? I don't know. And it's the same with, let's say, a food ordering app like Swiggy or Zomato. They have all of these costs that are not there when you like do the first ordering, and they just come in the net total, and it's broken down into this tax, this valuation, whatever, and you're like, what are all of these? Like, why am I paying so much? And then there's a discount code that comes, which you, if you apply it, then it'll just remove some of those extra additions, and you're like, is this discount really actually benefiting me? If you really think about it, I'm not sure. So these are some of the dark patterns that I've been noticing. And the other one was YouTube, where it says, they want you to switch to their the premium app, where it's a subscription based app. So it says, do you want to keep the ad version of the app, or do you want to go ad free? It sounds like it's beneficial to me to go, click ad free, but then it's actually not. So these are some of the dark patterns that I've noticed, and I realize it's all around us, and I'm assuming that they are increasing because internet services are increasing, and of course businesses online would be trying to figure out how to make more money and how they could extract more data from us. Sure, so of course it would most likely be increasing. So I think my problem as a reporter would be trying to sensitize people to keeping track of all of these things. And even more than that, like maybe users can't do much about it also because they're being tricked into it. That's what a dark pattern essentially is. So you're not voluntarily signing up for any of this. So maybe the larger problem as a journalist would be, how do you create change, or how do you inform enough people that this is an important matter, that maybe app developers, the large companies, should be addressing this and not be so dark in their patterns. Yeah.
Thanks, Regina. You've raised some really important questions there, including what each of us in our roles should be doing. And the point about if dark patterns are increasing, I'd actually like to turn to Madhulika for that and ask her what has been the effect of artificial intelligence and machine learning on dark patterns. Have they actually increased the use of deceptive techniques?
Thanks, Sunana. Now I feel really bad. I didn't spend more time reading up about dark patterns, but I'm glad we're joined by a panelist today. So the question that I have been thinking a lot about in my current role is, what's the responsibility of different communities when it comes to combating these dark patterns, right? So one community that we have been exploring is what's the responsibility of the research, specifically the AI research community. And I can see that I'm kickstarting the conversation into who needs to do what. And we're still kind of talking about the problem, but this kind of plays into why it's so difficult, perhaps, to spot these dark patterns before they land up in a consumer application. So AI research has increasingly been under the scanner for a variety of reasons. chief of them being that there's bias observed when algorithms are deployed in different contexts. So we know about bias in hiring algorithms, in criminal justice. We also know that AI tools can be used to, create like a synthetic reality. So that's the case with deepfakes and, synthetic voice, which can be put to malicious uses. But what we also know is that there are different communities which make these advancements happen, right? It's not happening out of thin air. There are real scientists who are kind of thinking about these questions and putting it out at machine learning conferences and machine learning journals. So what we have been kind of looking at is how can the research community start to think more about the downstream consequences of what they're proposing. So downstream consequences can be a variety of things, right? It can be positive impacts, it can be negative impacts. It can be, an AI advance that's put to put in an inappropriate, application, or something that's, conducive to accidents, or perhaps conducive to malicious uses. So just to kind of give you an example, a machine learning scientist who thinks about, let's say, a video manipulation technique, and their kind of use case is, this can be used in the gaming industry. But what also that scientist has to account for, that it can be used in non-consensual kind of imagery or videos against women, right? So part of what this, kind of entails is how can different communities through the lifeline or a life cycle of a product kind of consider how they can perhaps anticipate, right? You don't have to wait till the end to see it happen. How can you anticipate and mitigate some of the harmful consequences of technology advancements?
Thanks, Madhulika. And these are definitely some points that we need to return to. I'm also really curious to know if through your research, at a very practical level, how do you apply some of these solutions that you're talking about as a community that we need to find in terms of ethics? I'd like to bring in Venkatesh now, and Venkatesh, with the proliferation of dark patterns and our increased reliance on technology, the question of privacy comes up, and also how threatening are dark patterns to data protection and privacy. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Sunan. Thanks to ORF for pulling together another round of sci-fi. So thanks for getting this panel together on such a relevant topic. So I think the focus of this panel, raises a concern and also looks at a potential solution of responsible technology design, right? So I think those two intersect at many pressing issues, especially in the policy sector right now, which we are dealing with in India, right? So one's privacy, which you've spoken about, Sunena. The other is security, which is again an equally challenging topic. And the third aspect, which Madhu also spoke about, these are the three I thought I should share with in this discussion, is around AI, patterns, bias, so many other issues coming up with AI technology. So on all these issues, in these three issues that I identified, there are some areas where we've been working as BSA. So, happy to share more about them through the discussion. So for around on privacy, so one of the areas that we strongly advocate for is privacy by design. So I think that's an area where, as you move to developing these advanced technologies, they bring both opportunities and risks. So it's important that we leverage the opportunities, but also mitigate the risks involved, right? So dark patterns, or any such risk that we bring about while using these technologies, you will have to have a framework or a process to figure out how to address these risks. So just sharing some initial thoughts. I mean, we've tried to develop a few frameworks to address these risks as industry body, and we're also trying to see how well government and other stakeholders in the ecosystem are receptive to such frameworks. So just to share a couple of frameworks. So the PSA secure software framework is one such framework, and also the AI bias framework is another such. AI bias risk management framework is another such framework. So the idea behind all these, the approach for all these frameworks is to identify the risks involved, and figure out how do you identify the different risks in each of these as a user when you're using it, as a developer when you're developing such products and technologies. So throughout the life cycle, identify all the risks. So design, development, deployment, end use, all these phases. And secondly, how do you mitigate those risks? Try to come up with processes. And finally, also look at how do you put in a set of, which Deepika mentioned, how do you build in awareness, sensitization? How do you ensure that this is implemented not just by the industry but also by users, right? So how do you ensure that everyone signs up to some of these processes voluntarily or through a policy? So I think these are some of the challenges that I've been working on in the last few years at BSA. Happy to participate and share more details as we go through this session.
There's already quite a bit of work being done in that regard. Deepika, my first question to you is in terms of public policy and regulation, and you are working with the government as well. How much of this is being addressed, and to go back to the point that you made about research showing how certain groups of people who are socially disadvantaged, who are perhaps not as digitally literate, are more susceptible to dark patterns, and that can in some ways end up further exacerbating social inequities. So how do you think we can approach this and look for solutions?
Um, so Naina, my work at the ministry, maybe I think how I'd put it best is like I'm a fly on the wall more so, and we get to present a lot of perspectives to the ministry. So I can speak to the kind of interests that our public policy, our bureaucrats designing public policy have at the moment. So like all of them have mentioned, a lot of this comes through to the government officials as well, right? And there's a lot of interest within the government to design policies to really codify this into legislation as well. So there is a lot of conversation happening around this. But one place where what I come from is that while we all talk about privacy, our online behaviors are a little inconsistent when it comes to really putting our foot down and going through the terms and conditions, which is fair because consent fatigue is real. So I think more so one stance that's very interesting for me to see the government's taking at the moment is instead of putting the onus on the citizen for towards being responsible for their own privacy, there's also a lot more push to sort of think about their digital governance solutions, think about their products so in a transparent framework. And I think that's why a lot of the government solutions are obviously open source, because they are willing to hear more from citizens about what how to rework, how to do better, and make sure that security and privacy is entrenched in such a design, which is why most of their architectures are open sourced at the moment, and will hopefully continue to be. So I think this is one way in which they're trying to solve for making sure that nobody's left behind in this digitization drive. And the other way is also that I think there's a lot of cognizance about the fact that innovation has sort of superseded regulations. And there's and also an understanding that we don't want regulatory hindrances towards innovation either. So there's a lot of explorations on the concept of sandboxing as well. I think our financial sector, SEBI and IRDAI have sandboxes put in place. The health NHA has a sandbox put in place at the moment, where they're really working alongside innovators to codify what it would mean. Because I think we're all still at a principle level, at least in policy design, when we're talking about ethics and privacy, really translating that into technical design and then codifying it into law, and like having multiple sectoral regulators speak to each other, because innovations don't work in silos. It's not a healthcare innovation alone. Oftentimes it's health insurance, so it needs to work alongside the financial sector as well. So what really it means for multiple parties to come together and work for is, I think, aspect of the government. And as a fellow of the International Innovation Core program as well, we've had the chance, many of our teams Like my team works at the Ministry of Electronics and IT. We have the Young Leaders in Tech Policy program where we work across different civil society organizations, where we're able to rally these causes and take it back to our government stakeholders to talk about specific either use cases or case studies about what's going right and what's not, and then designing our interventions accordingly.
Thanks, Deepika. Regina, I'd like to turn to you, and you raised the point about raising awareness on this topic through your work as a tech writer and journalist. How do you think that can be done, and how do you think are there any ways that we can hold business models, platforms, and the tech industry accountable for harmful practices?
Raising awareness about privacy at this point, it's tough. It's really hard. Even with the Pegasus issue, it's still hard to make it a national issue that the whole of India will care about and will go up in arms about, because something about privacy, it's something that is not seen, and especially online privacy, I don't think a lot of people still realize that your right to privacy still matters when you're online, when you're using an app. So raising awareness is going to be a slow process, but it will happen, I'm sure, in the coming years. But it's difficult. How do we make the app developers and the businesses more responsible? That was your next question, right? You know, right now there's a lot of whistleblowers and former Facebook employees that speak up about how Facebook could be held more responsible. And currently, there is a whistleblower who's testifying at the Senate in the US about how Facebook could be held more accountable. And one of the things that they talk about would be all these, these technical people who know more about Facebook and how the inside of one of the largest tech companies in the world works, is making the policymakers and the lawmakers more aware of how things like algorithms work. Like currently, these former Facebook employees are talking about, don't focus on hate speech, don't focus on trying to regulate misinformation or provocative content. Try focusing on the algorithms that work at the back end that will show the users what they see, or and what could be provocative, or what could be tricking the mind of the user to think in a way, or perform actions that they otherwise would not do. So maybe a place to start with is, I don't know if how easy this is, but getting the employees, or at least former employees, or people who are experts in the field, who have worked with these tech companies, like if they speak up more, then that would be a good place to start. And once they speak up, I think regulators, the lawmakers, would be, it will be easier for them to understand how these large companies, how these apps work. Because right now, I don't think regulators know enough about how algorithms work and why fake news travels fast, and can we stop it? And that could also extend to things like, how do we stop these, the fake discounts, or tricking people into buying things, or controlling dark patterns might be a bit easier if more people from the industry speak up, which currently is not happening as much as I would like for it to happen. But I think that's a good place to start.
Right. Let's direct that question to Madhulika. In fact, I know you've given this some thought about the role of the scientific community in promoting ethically conscious design. So your thoughts on that, and you also made a reference to synthetic data, and many see it as a sort of emerging solution to the issue of biased data sets. Do you see any limitations to the use of synthetic data? And I think it might help if you actually give us a quick primer on how synthetic data works and how it works differently in observing data, in observing biases in actual data.
Sure. So I feel more comfortable kind of answering the first question, perhaps. So even as we kind of talk about top-down regulation and what's the role of regulators, and that's an important lever. Another one to consider is also what's the role of kind of community-based governance norms, right? And I say that in part because scientific research, and in this case, what we're talking about here, AI or tech research, can be a space that's really hard to regulate. If you think about it, research is an international enterprise. Researchers exist all around the world. They get funded by, folks who are, in a different country. So it's kind of harder to, think of a policy or a law that can, account for the harms that research can produce. It's also kind of complicated perhaps because research moves at a pace that, is perhaps even faster than, products move at. So it's even harder to kind of inform regulators to get them to, regulate research. And perhaps, one of the things that makes it the hardest is, you want research to be open. You especially want scientific research to be open. That's how we have chanced upon, so many discoveries like the, penicillin. And you don't want, perhaps to create a mechanism that can be, conducive to any sort of a regulatory capture. So even as we think about top-down regulation, I think we still need to think about what's the responsibility that technologists, that scientific community, the research community can take upon themselves. And just to kind of take it a step back, because one natural question could be, why do researchers need to have to, why do they have to do this in the first place? So perhaps the best analogy, and it can be, flawed, but if you think about us, driving a car out on the road, we are held responsible not just for the intended consequences, but also for the foreseeable and unintended consequences, right? So if you see a pedestrian and they're in the way, it's your duty to kind of see what you can do about it and to avoid any sort of an accident. And that's kind of similar. Again, there are limits to this analogy, but it's similar to what a researcher does. We often see, papers out there where they speak to the positive consequences of what they're proposing, right? You're never going to see a paper where someone admits that what they're writing doesn't have a positive value to society. But the opposite is also true, that in the wrong hands, it can be used in a negative way, or that a company can perhaps not impose the guardrails and use that technology in a manner that could be considered irresponsible. So researchers can have the unique vantage point, and they're right at the beginning. And especially with AI research, what we're seeing is they're being commercialized at a rate that hasn't been seen before, right? Be it with facial recognition or even most of the modern technologies that we have embedded in products around us have been an outcome of a researcher's proposal in the first place. So in terms of what researchers can do, and we have been seeing some practices emerge, is include a statement within their paper about how it can be used negatively, right? So that's going to take some thinking on the part of the researcher, and this is not easy. Researchers aren't futurists. They're not going to turn one overnight, but to carefully consider how, what are some potential negative downstream consequences of something that they're proposing. So that's kind of the starting point. We're seeing some actors start to adopt it, but ultimately it's going to be up to individual researchers. Because in AI research, folks often put out papers that are not in conferences or journals, that can be in preprints, that can be in blogs. So I think there is an individual responsibility that researchers still need to kind of adopt. And that can really, perhaps, perform a function of, stopping some of these ill effects that we're seeing later on in the life cycle.
Right, you've actually brought us to a very important question. Why do researchers need to do this? Venkatesh, what does the industry think of this? I know you outlined some of the measures that the industry has put in place, but is it enough? And how does the industry look at its responsibility in this?
Yeah, so I mean, as we look at any technology, as I outlined, right, there are great opportunities that it brings. So I think to understand that, like even in the last 2 years during COVID, the last year and a half, looked at phenomenal digital transformation, right? The innovation that has been brought about has been has made us able to talk. I mean, a conference like CyFy, where participants can come from across the world from the comfort of their homes to participate. I think that's fantastic. I think to recognize that innovation has its place is the starting point of any such regulation processes that you would identify. So I mean, what the industry has realized, I mean, one strong aspect of technology use is trust. If consumers do not trust technology, I think it becomes really challenging for technology players to produce anything that would get used. So I think that's a starting point for a lot of companies, right? Are consumers trusting us? And so you evolve from there, because consumers, their needs change over time, and they change rapidly, and innovation has to keep pace with that. Policies, government regulations eventually follow, right? So I think that's what industry is aware of, that before governments across the world look at these issues, we have to start looking at them. So GDPR, and the privacy policy landscape, GDPR did that. As countries across the world grappled with the issue, GDPR came up with some sort of a standard or a model for privacy laws. Similarly, you're looking at Europe taking the lead on some of these issues. So at the very starting point, companies are trying to be more proactive, trying to ask governments across the world to look at these issues, but they themselves internally are looking at these issues. In AI is a classic example of challenges that are coming forth that companies realize that they themselves might not be able to solve, right? So like in the AI design lifecycle, you have so many stakeholders coming together. You have the designer, the researcher, the designer, the developer, the deployer, and then all of them are not, I mean, the companies would not be able to look at all these processes, right? So it's very important that a community or a multi-stakeholder-led model of choosing how to address these risks come about. One example is even within the companies, as teams develop, you see diversity playing an important role in developing such software. So given the socio, the nature of technology today is quite diverse, right? So you are having so many touch points. So diversity within the organization becomes a strong pillar of development, right from design to development. So you have many teams coming together to develop the technology, and they might have competing interests. That's exactly what I wanted to bring, saying somebody from, say, a product development team would not see eye to eye with someone from an ethics and governance team, would not see eye to eye with a legal team. So as many teams come together, what we are seeing consistently is many more questions being asked within the companies, many more solutions coming up. So as much as we identify all these challenges, I'm also fully confident that some of these issues will have to be solved by companies sooner or later, because trust, which is one of the fundamental pillars for technology use, has to be guaranteed. Otherwise, consumers will not come back to your app.
Right. And just to clarify, you've been talking about companies. Are you talking about Indian tech here? Can you specify what role they've been playing?
Yeah, so I mean, across the board, obviously, I would be much better in place to share our global tech companies. But that said, there is a lot of initiatives that have been done in India tech as well to address these concerns, given the phenomenal use that we've seen in the last year.
Right. Which brings me to the next part of this question, of this conversation, which is on ethics as a service. As the ethical conundrums that the tech industry is dealing with become more and more complicated, ethics as a service, privacy as a service have emerged as new business models. The question is, who is responsible for ethics? And do these models serve consumer interests? Or do they enable a commodification of values that should actually be instilled at the design stage? Madhulika, would you like to take that on?
Yeah, I was just reflecting about it as you posted. Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer to the question, to be honest with you. I don't see why commodification is a crime. I think touting a service as more privacy protective, can be something that's of commercial value and that's, also ethical. So I don't see how that's, antithetical to, doing right by, consumers. So yeah, I'm not really sure if I feel that strongly about selling anything as privacy protective, you know, yeah, being exploitative. I think the question really is, how do you make sure that you can validate any of the claims that any organization, any tech company chooses to make? I think that's the important question, because you can be ethics as a service or what have you, and you might strongly believe it, but it may not in fact be true in practice. So that's what comes to my mind. Like, how do you validate some of these? In many cases, kind of marketing, kind of um, yeah, marketing, messages or narratives that you put out there. I think that's the open question for me. And to answer your first part of the question, should it be a responsibility, for designers and developers? That's entirely true. I think the question is, what's the right lever to use in which cases, and to kind of recognize that, yeah, we have more than one lever at our disposal, right? You have, in some cases, you might have professional associations that some of these folks belong to, in which case, consider how that can be perhaps used to, enforce any sort of a policy to make them, perform more ethically in their respective roles. We can consider top-down regulation. We can consider, what I kind of proposed earlier, which is more community-based. Every single individual designer or researcher recognizing that they have a role to play. I think that's where my mind goes. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does, and it's also left us with more questions, which is always a good sign for a discussion. Who validates this? I'm afraid that we don't have that much time left in the discussion, and I would actually like to get comments from all four of you with the time that we have left. So, if we can take about 2 minutes each and hear from each of you your closing thoughts. On this discussion on dark patterns and responsible design. Let's start with you, Deepika.
I just have one very quick comment as well to your previous questions, and I think definitely, you're entrenching privacy in the design of your software, sure, but the usability of your settings is just as important as the software design as well. So I do think there is a lot of this on the designers to make sure that privacy is ensured at every stage. And as for commodification, that's once again I'm grappling with what I feel about that term. One helpful framework that's helped me to think about this is thinking about data as a right versus data as a property. And I think that sort of framework is super useful to think how we want governance around data to be structured. And I think we didn't have time in this conversation to touch upon synthetic data, but when we talk about synthetic data and removing it from the individual itself, and also course correcting for all historic biases, I think there is a lot of potential that I see in terms of both, removing this as well as ensuring that, reducing risk of de-anonymization, associated risks, etc. But I think as closing remarks, the thing that's really standing out for me from all the panelists' points as well is that in the who is responsible for what question, like what Venkatesh mentioned as well, diversity of teams is what is really sticking out, because even when you're correcting for biases by producing synthetic data, who's your team? Are you overcorrecting? And are we meaning diversity just in terms of like gender, class, caste, or are we talking about the disciplines in which we're trained? Are we having anthropologists in the conversation of property versus rights, or is it only technologists? So I think really one interesting what's very helpful is to bring multidisciplinary teams and representative teams to think about these conversations. And I think that's happening more and more across industry, government as well.
Thank you very much, Deepika. Regina, what are your thoughts?
Just that AI is a new field, and I recognize that there will be mistakes made as we move forward. and that's okay. So maybe it's all right if we take our time and fix things as we go along rather than moving too fast. AI once again with the question about synthetic data, and I think it's important to make sure that the data that you're using to make these algorithms is good and correct. So that would be an important point. And as Venkatesh said, trust is important. So I feel like companies have they have a fair point why they should make themselves trustworthy. They have a fair point for why they should not be resorting to dark patterns or tricking users into using their product more, because once you're found out, that trust is lost. So yeah, that's about it.
Thanks, Regina. Madhulika?
Yeah, I'd really like to echo what my fellow panelists said. And I'm doing this not because I'm lazy, but I agree with what they said, which is that there is a space for interdisciplinary expertise. I don't think, part of kind of the rhetoric is that these are hard challenges, these are difficult to solve. And that is true. But we also know is that many disciplines are built around thinking about impact of technology in society. And you can consider social sciences as a another sounding board to perhaps think through just the history of technology in different societies, right? Because many of these versions of these challenges have been kind of observed in the past as well. So that's kind of my takeaway. How do you create space for technologists and researchers to really be able to access interdisciplinary expertise? And yeah, what's the role of tech companies, research labs in making that connection happen? I think that's kind of the open question for me.
The last word is yours, Venkatesh.
Thanks. I mean, I'll start off by saying that emerging technologies, disruptive technologies, have a great potential to create change, address some of the most pressing concerns, whether it's in governance or environment. So that's I think a great starting point. So we have to make sure that we consider the benefits of these new technologies alongside proactive prevention and risk mitigation, right? So I think this is the balance that we have to strike. And with any challenge, you can only solve them when you bring different stakeholders together from across the board. I think that would be an important opportunity for everybody to participate in similar discussions. I mean, this is a great discussion, and similar discussions try to understand each other's perspective so that we can accelerate digital transformation, foster trust, and make sure that users and consumers get a sense of joy using technology. I mean, that's what I would try to focus on. Thank you.
I love that actually. We must not forget that there is also the joy in using technology. So many thoughts have emerged from this. Thank you so much to our panelists. We've had a very fruitful discussion. We've talked about the great potential for change in emerging technology, but also the awareness for risk. The importance of bringing diversity of teams and an interdisciplinary approach, which includes the social sciences, and also the fact that we will find solutions as we go along, and which is why conversations like this become very important. We need to find networks and allies as we look for solutions to address the dark side of tech and reclaim our tech futures. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to everyone.